John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on the 3rd of January, 1892. At a considerably young age, he showed signs of an extraordinary talent with letters and languages, an intellectual trait his mother noticed keenly and was encouraged to pursue them. Most importantly, a love for words had grown within him very early on. Indeed, he had learned how to read and write by the time he was 4 years old. Most of Tolkien's life was spent pursuing academic studies. Of course, his knowledge of languages and love for words guided him along a literary path, a road composed of ancient texts. He swiftly developed a keen interest in them, devouring as many Germanic myths as he could find, a list that includes the Poetic Edda and the Icelandic sagas. The languages he first found most intoxicating were Old and Middle English, Norse, Icelandic, Gothic, Finnish, and especially Welsh. Finnish and Welsh in particular became a significant source of inspiration for the creation of his own languages and fictional writings. Of Finnish, Tolkien said, "It was like discovering a complete wine cellar filled with bottles of an amazing wine of a kind and flavor never tasted before. It quite intoxicated me." Tolkien became an orphan at age 12, and it was in the new residence to which he was moved that he met his future wife, Edith Bratt. Tolkien knew love, friendship, pain, and loss in his lifetime. Of the former, his wife proved an inspiration to him, both in his everyday life and fictional writings. In addition, he made many friends and companions throughout his academic career. One particular fellowship he was a part of during his young life consisted of a group of kindred spirits with whom he created a club devoted to the arts and tea drinking. It began in his school library, but eventually moved to the tea room formerly known as Barrow's Stores, known today as the Square Peg Bar, located on Corporation Street, Birmingham. The group was small, but the most prominent members were Tolkien, Christopher Wiseman, R.Q. Gilson, and Geoffrey Bache Smith. This club soon became known as the Tea Club Barovian Society, or the TCBS. A beautiful and influential fellowship emerged from this passionate gathering, and doubtless became one of the most cherished memories from Tolkien's undergraduate days. He worked diligently at acquiring a scholarship for Oxford, eventually achieving an open classical exhibition to Exeter College. If there was one title that Tolkien wished to be called, it would have been comparative philologist, one who studies words and their etymologies. It was at Oxford that he was able to delve deeper into his love for words, for included in his syllabus was comparative philology. He chose it as a special subject and thus obtained the opportunity to flourish in this academic passion. Tolkien's extraordinary talent with words and names reflects his creative genius. There are many examples of elements within his stories that emerged from either the meaning of a word or name. Tolkien once said in an interview, "It gives me great pleasure, a good name. I always, in writing, start with a name. Give me a name and it produces a story, not the other way about normally." It is no surprise that when Tolkien sat down to write the Moderation's examinations, he achieved a nearly perfect paper in the philology portion. The study of languages was clearly his strongest talent, and the college noticed, suggesting that he become a philologist. But before long, World War I had broken out, so Tolkien went off to fight in the bitter trenches of the Somme. During wartime, he tragically discovered that two of his best friends, R.Q. Gilson and Geoffrey Bache Smith, had died. Fighting both an external bloody and internal psychological war, he pushed on bravely. But he soon caught trench fever and was sent home, back to his love Edith and a life pursuing an academic career. Upon his return, he ambitiously strode forward, seeking employment in his line of work. After a diligent journey of academic endeavors, assisting with the New English Dictionary, marking examinations for various universities, and teaching students the Anglo-Saxon language, Tolkien had become the professor of English language at Leeds University, and 1 year later he achieved being appointed as the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Pembroke University. Throughout his academic career, Tolkien worked on rigorous translations of old texts, most notable that of the Middle English romance Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and the Old English poem Beowulf. With a clear passion and genuine desire to teach his students, he conducted lectures also on these texts. Tolkien was famous for having a pipe incessantly dangling from his mouth, even during lectures, in addition to his tendency to mumble and speak rapidly. But this did not at all stain his reputation as a lecturer. Many of his students deeply admired him as a professor, and others would often come running to his lecture room to experience his animated performance of Beowulf. The experience was later expressed by one of his students. He could turn a lecture room into a mead hall, in which he was the bard and we were the feasting, listening guests. Such a dramatic spectacle impressed upon the students that the ancient text was more than a mere historical text to be analyzed, but a powerful piece of poetry to be appreciated. When Tolkien and Edith began to have children, he was inspired to write a fairy story for them. It began one summer's day while Tolkien was sitting by the window of his study marking exam papers. In an interview years later, Tolkien recalled,
"The actual beginning, though it's not really the beginning, but the actual flashpoint was, I remember very clearly. I can still see the corner in my house in 20 Northmore Road where it happened. I got an enormous pile of exam papers there, and marking school examinations in the summertime is an enormous, very laborious, and unfortunately also boring. And I remember picking up a paper and actually finding, I nearly gave an extra mark for it, extra 5 marks actually. There was one page on this particular paper was left blank. Glorious. Nothing to read. So I scribbled on it, I can't think why. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.
It is no surprise here that this story began with a single word, hobbit. The Hobbit was only intended to be a tale read aloud to his children. In fact, he eventually abandoned the story's plot, leaving it to lie in his desk drawer. But the tale was also shared with friends of the family when they visited for tea. One in particular knew a woman who was working for the publisher Allen and Unwin. To them, she thought it ought to be shown, and when it was, George Allen and Unwin encouraged Tolkien to complete the story, for they wished to publish it. Tolkien leapt into the task, and the story proved a worldwide success, not at all what he expected. The book was read by Stanley Unwin's 10-year-old son, Rayner, who wrote the following report for it. Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit who lived in his hobbit hole and never went for adventures. At last Gandalf the wizard and his dwarves persuaded him to go. He had a very exciting time fighting goblins and wargs. At last they got to the Lonely Mountain. Smaug, the dragon who guards it, is killed, and after a terrific battle with the goblins, he returned home, rich. This book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations. It is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9. But folk were soon clamoring for more books about hobbits, so he felt obligated to write another. His initial intention was to write another single book. However, the story substantially grew in the telling. After 12 years, the great work had become 6 books, known today as The Lord of the Rings. The publication of these 2 classic stories, followed by the Silmarillion, the core of Tolkien's imaginative writings, which he passionately worked on throughout his entire life, and was posthumously published by his son Christopher, has made Tolkien one of the most famous authors of fantasy to date. Over 45 years later, his stories are still read and beloved by countless readers all over the world. Tolkien and Edith lived a happily married life for 55 years. They are both buried beside one another at the Wolvercott Cemetery in Oxford. Upon Tolkien's gravestone, the name Beren is inscribed, while Edith's bears the name Luthien. These names are a reference to the tale of Beren and Luthien from the Silmarillion, in which a man and immortal elf princess fall deeply in love. Luthien sacrifices her immortality so that she can remain in Middle-earth with Beren, a mortal. Together they face the darkest known dangers of their world. And like Tolkien's life story, it is a tale filled with heroic will, determination, hardship, and everlasting love. But perhaps their relationship and how dear Edith was to Tolkien is best described in his own words. I never called Edith Luthien, but she was the source of the story that in time became the chief part of the Silmarillion. It was first conceived in a small woodland glade filled with hemlocks at Roos in Yorkshire. In those days her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you have seen them, and she could sing and dance. I thank you for visiting my channel, Amalian, and for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing and subscribing for more videos on the life of J.R.R. Tolkien, which are soon to come.